My name is Amelia. I'm 43 years old, and if I had to describe my life in one word, it would be predictable. Not in a bad way. Mind you, I've built a world that feels safe, structured, and mine. I work as a freelance editor, which means most days I'm surrounded by books and a laptop in the comfort of my apartment. My evenings are spent with a cup of chamomile tea, a playlist of soft piano melodies, and the occasional indulgence in an old romantic film. Quiet, uncomplicated, familiar. But sometimes, late at night, as I stare at the faint patterns of city lights filtering through my curtains, I wonder if my life is missing something. Or someone. It was on a Wednesday, a perfectly ordinary day, that everything changed. I'd gone to the little café on Maple Street where I often worked when I needed a change of scenery. It was small and cozy, the kind of place where the staff knew your name and your coffee order. I was seated at my usual corner table, half focused on editing a manuscript about a woman finding herself in the French countryside, when he walked in. I didn't notice him at first. He blended in like everyone else. But then, as if pulled by some unseen thread, my eyes were drawn to him. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a relaxed yet confident air about him. Dark, slightly tousled hair, a sharp jawline softened by a hint of stubble. He was carrying a book, something rare to see in this digital age. He sat 2 tables away, completely engrossed in whatever he was reading. I couldn't help but steal glances at him, my chest tightening in a way that felt unfamiliar. It wasn't just that he was attractive. It was the way he moved, so unhurried and self-assured. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. There was something magnetic about him, something that stirred emotions I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity, fascination, longing. I stayed longer at the café than I'd planned, pretending to work while watching him out of the corner of my eye. When he finally stood to leave, I felt a pang of disappointment. But instead of going back to my laptop, I did something I'd never done before. I followed him. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, or the mystery of the book he held. All I know is that my feet moved before my mind could argue. Keeping a careful distance, I watched as he strolled down the street, completely unaware of my presence. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the encounter in my mind, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and shame. What was I doing? This wasn't me. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something significant about him, something I needed to understand. Tomorrow, I promised myself I'd go back to my routine. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't. The next day, I woke up feeling restless. I told myself to let it go, to bury the memory of him like so many other fleeting moments in my life. But the truth was I couldn't. He'd ignited something in me, a spark, a quiet thrill I didn't want to extinguish. By mid-afternoon, I found myself back at the café on Maple Street, seated at my usual table, feigning interest in my laptop. I wasn't working, though. I was waiting, hoping to see him again. And then, as if on cue, he appeared. The same confident walk, the same book in hand. He ordered a coffee and sat at a table by the window. My heart raced as I watched him from behind the safety of my screen. I couldn't help but notice the little details about him. The way he ran his fingers through his hair when he paused to think. The subtle tap of his fingers on the table as he read. He was mesmerizing, and I felt like I was seeing the world in color for the first time in years. When he left, I followed him again. I kept my distance, careful not to draw attention to myself. He walked to a nearby park and settled onto a bench under an old oak tree. He opened his book and read, the sunlight casting a warm glow on his face. For 3 days, this became my secret routine. I'd watch him at the café, follow him to the park, and observe him from a distance. I knew it was irrational, borderline absurd even. But something about him felt magnetic, almost fateful. On the 3rd day, something shifted. As he sat at his usual spot in the park, he looked up, his eyes scanning the surroundings. For a brief moment, our gazes met. My breath caught. I quickly looked away, pretending to admire the trees or the pigeons or anything else that wasn't him. But when I dared to glance back, he was still watching me, a small, almost knowing smile on his lips. Was it coincidence? Or had he noticed me before? That evening, I sat in my apartment, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, as though he knew I'd been there all along. It sent a thrill down my spine and left me wondering, Was this connection real? Or was I simply imagining it? As I sipped my tea and stared out the window, I realized I couldn't stop now. I had to know who he was, what he was thinking, and why, for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. The next day, I woke up feeling restless. I told myself to let it go, to bury the memory of him like so many other fleeting moments in my life. But the truth was I couldn't. He'd ignited something in me, a spark, a quiet thrill I didn't want to extinguish. By mid-afternoon, I found myself back at the café on Maple Street, seated at my usual table, feigning interest in my laptop. I wasn't working, though. I was waiting, hoping to see him again. And then, as if on cue, he appeared. The same confident walk, the same book in hand. He ordered a coffee and sat at a table by the window. My heart raced as I watched him from behind the safety of my screen. I couldn't help but notice the little details about him. The way he ran his fingers through his hair when he paused to think. The subtle tap of his fingers on the table as he read. He was mesmerizing, and I felt like I was seeing the world in color for the first time in years. When he left, I followed him again. I kept my distance, careful not to draw attention to myself. He walked to a nearby park and settled onto a bench under an old oak tree. He opened his book and read, the sunlight casting a warm glow on his face. For 3 days, this became my secret routine. I'd watch him at the cafe, follow him to the park, and observe him from a distance. I knew it was irrational, borderline absurd even. But something about him felt magnetic, almost fateful. On the 3rd day, something shifted. As he sat at his usual spot in the park, he looked up, his eyes scanning the surroundings. For a brief moment, our gazes met. My breath caught. I quickly looked away, pretending to admire the trees or the pigeons or anything else that wasn't him. But when I dared to glance back, he was still watching me, a small, almost knowing smile on his lips. Was it coincidence? Or had he noticed me before? That evening, I sat in my apartment, replaying the moment over and over in my mind. The way he'd looked at me, as though he knew I'd been there all along. It sent a thrill down my spine and left me wondering, was this connection real? Or was I simply imagining it? As I sipped my tea and stared out the window, I realized I couldn't stop now. I had to know who he was, what he was thinking, and why, for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. By the time Adrian and I reached my apartment, my nerves were teetering between exhilaration and absolute panic. I'd spent years creating a life that didn't invite much company, and now here I was, holding the door open for a man who had, in just days, managed to shatter the quiet monotony of my existence. "Welcome to my little sanctuary," I said, trying to sound casual as I flicked on the lights. The soft, warm glow illuminated the space I called home. Books stacked in every corner, an overstuffed armchair by the window, and a vase of lavender on the table. Adrian smiled as he stepped inside. "It's cozy. Feels like a place where stories live." His words made me smile. It was exactly how I'd always thought of it. "Make yourself comfortable," I said, motioning toward the living room. I busied myself in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal while he explored my shelves. I could hear him murmuring the titles under his breath, and for some reason, it felt oddly intimate, as though he was learning little pieces of me through the books I loved. When dinner was ready, we sat at my small wooden table, the space between us feeling both vast and impossibly close. Conversation flowed easily about his writing, my editing, and the peculiarities of life. But beneath the words, there was something else, a tension, a magnetic pull that made every glance linger a little too long, every accidental touch of our hands feel like a spark. After dinner, we moved to the couch. I poured us both glasses of wine, hoping it would steady the fluttering in my chest. But as we sat there, the silence between us grew heavier, charged with unspoken emotion. Adrian was the first to break it. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, my breath catching. "I've noticed you," he admitted, his eyes holding mine. "At the cafe in the park. I wasn't sure if it was all in my head, but I couldn't stop looking for you." My heart swelled at his words, a mix of relief and disbelief washing over me. "I noticed you too," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "From the moment you walked in." He leaned closer then, so close I could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. It feels like I've known you longer than a few days, he murmured, his hand brushing mine. And then, without another word, he kissed me. The world seemed to stop as his lips met mine, soft and tentative at first, then deepening with a passion that felt both unexpected and inevitable. It was as though all the years of solitude, all the doubts and fears, melted away in that moment. We spent the rest of the evening tangled in one another, talking, laughing, and exploring the connection that had drawn us together. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something I hadn't even realized I was longing for. When the night faded into early morning, and we lay in the quiet glow of the city lights spilling through my window, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't thinking about what came next. I was simply there, present in the moment with him. And it was enough. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, golden and soft, casting a gentle warmth over the room. I woke before Adrian, his steady breathing a quiet rhythm beside me. For a long moment, I just watched him, taking in the peaceful expression on his face. It felt surreal, as if the events of the past few days had been plucked from someone else's life, a younger, braver woman unafraid to take risks. And yet here I was, my heart fuller than it had been in years, my mind caught between disbelief and the quiet thrill of possibility. I slipped out of bed and padded into the kitchen, making coffee as I replayed every moment from the night before. The way Adrian looked at me, like I was the only person in the room. The way his laughter filled the air, softening every corner of my home. The way his touch made me feel alive in ways I'd long forgotten. When he appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, his shirt rumpled from sleep, I felt an unexpected wave of nervousness. But then he smiled, that easy, disarming smile that had undone me from the start. "Good morning," he said, his voice warm and still laced with sleep. "Morning," I replied, handing him a mug of coffee. We sat together at the kitchen table, the silence between us comfortable and companionable. Adrian glanced around the room, his eyes landing on the photographs on the wall. A few snapshots of my family, my childhood home, and one of me from years ago, taken during a long-forgotten vacation. "You look so happy in this one," he said, pointing to the photo of me sitting by the sea, my hair wild in the wind. I chuckled softly. "That was a lifetime ago." "Maybe," he said, his gaze steady. "But that part of you is still there. I see it." His words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd thought of myself as someone whose brightest days were behind her. But in that moment, with Adrian sitting across from me, it was as if he saw something in me I hadn't seen in years. A spark, a light, a version of myself I'd almost forgotten. As the morning unfolded, we talked about everything and nothing. About his writing, his love for old bookstores, his habit of people watching in cafes. About my quiet life, my work, and the way I'd hidden behind routine for so long. "I think I was afraid," I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Afraid of stepping outside my little world, of being seen. Adrian reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "You don't have to hide anymore," he said simply. It was such a small thing, his hand over mine, but it felt like a promise. A reminder that life didn't have to be lonely, that connections could still be made, even in the unlikeliest of ways. When he left that afternoon, promising to see me again soon, my apartment felt different. Lighter. Like it was no longer just a space I occupied, but a place where something new and beautiful had begun. I spent the rest of the day in quiet reflection, thinking about how much my life had changed in such a short time. I hadn't planned for this, hadn't expected to meet someone like Adrian. But as I sat by the window, watching the world go by, I realized something important. Sometimes, the best things in life come when you stop planning and start letting yourself feel. For the first time in years, I felt like I was waking up, not just from a night of sleep, but from the long, quiet slumber my life had become. And Adrian, he was the light that made me see days turned into weeks, and Adrian became a constant presence in my life. Each time we met, it felt like peeling back another layer of myself, layers I hadn't even realized were there. With him, I was unguarded, free to laugh, to feel, to be something other than the quiet, predictable woman I'd resigned myself to being. But as much as I reveled in the connection we shared, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered doubts. The world had opinions about women like me, Women who dared to embrace something unconventional, something that defied expectation. A woman in her 40s falling for a man nearly a decade younger. It wasn't supposed to happen, was it? One evening, as we sat together on my couch, a soft rain tapping against the window, I found the courage to voice my fears. Adrian, I began hesitantly, my fingers fidgeting with the edge of a blanket. Do you ever think about the difference between us? The years, the lives we've lived? He turned to me, his expression thoughtful but unwavering. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't, he admitted. But what I feel for you has nothing to do with numbers or timelines. It's you, Amelia. It's always been you. Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen without judgment. I've spent so long convincing myself that love, real, true love, was something that only belonged to my past, I said quietly. But with you it feels like I've been given a second chance. He reached for my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. That's the thing about love, he said. It doesn't care about rules or timing. It finds you when you least expect it. You just have to be brave enough to let it in. And I was brave. With Adrian by my side, I stopped shrinking into the background, stopped letting the opinions of others dictate how I saw myself. I let myself feel the joy of being desired, the thrill of being vulnerable, the quiet contentment of simply being loved. Our relationship wasn't perfect. No love ever is. There were moments of doubt, moments where I questioned whether I deserved this kind of happiness. But every time I faltered, Adrian was there, steady and sure, reminding me that love wasn't something I had to earn. It was something to embrace, flaws and all. As the weeks stretched into months, I found myself changing in ways I hadn't anticipated. I started taking more risks, trying new things, meeting new people, rediscovering the passions I'd buried beneath the weight of routine. But perhaps the biggest change of all was the way I saw myself. For so long, I defined myself by what I'd lost: time, opportunities, love. But now I saw myself as someone who still had so much to give, so much to experience. One evening, as Adrian and I sat together watching the sunset from my balcony, he turned to me and said, "You're different now, you know." In the best way. "How so?" I asked, curious. "You're not just living your life anymore," he said with a smile. "You're loving it." And he was right. Meeting Adrian had been a spark, but the fire that followed wasn't just about him. It was about me, about rediscovering the parts of myself I'd thought were lost, about daring to embrace the messiness and beauty of life. As I leaned into Adrian's embrace, watching the sky shift from gold to pink to deep indigo, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. This wasn't just a love story. It was a story of becoming, of finding myself again, in the most unexpected of ways. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. I was ready,